Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to study the final parak in the book of Zechariah. So we will complete the book of Zechariah today. This is chapter 14, parak Yudalid. The prophet begins with the following verse, Hine Yom Ba L'Adonai, the day, behold, is coming, the day of God. The Yom Hashem, the day of God, we've had in many of the prophets, and generally refers to that day in the future when justice finally happens, when the wicked are punished, when the good are rewarded, when the world is just in a way that we can see and it's obvious that God is in charge. And that booty, that spoils which has been taken and stolen from you over the many, many years, this refers, of course, to belongings, physical belongings and wealth, but just everything that's been taken away from you over the years will be divided up and given back among you. So you will see that final act of justice. If you remember the chapter before, we discussed how the what was going to happen on this great big battle, the day of the great battle of the future, when the nations of the world will gather against Jerusalem, and God would fight for Jerusalem, and that the people of those nations will mostly be destroyed, but then there will be many left. Those that are left will end up becoming coming under the wings of God, so to speak, that they will be redeemed as well. We're going to see a similar idea here. Zechariah, after talking about that Bayom Hahu, that or actually in this case it's Yom Ba, that day of Hashem, the day of God which is coming, he then goes back to that battle. V'yasafti es kol hagayim. On that day, what's going to happen? I will gather all of the nations El Yerushalayim against Jerusalem, milchama, in a war. V'nilkedah ha'ir, the city will be captured, or at least the city will be captured in this war. V'nashasu habatim, homes will be destroyed. V'hanashim tishachavna, and unfortunately, as often happens in terrible wars, women will be violated. V'yatzah ha'ir bagola, and half of the city will end up going out, being exiled. V'yeser ha'am, but the remainder of the people in the city, lo yikares min ha'ir, will remain there. They will remain in the city because they will be saved. Before, if we remember, we mentioned that 2/3 of the attackers were going to die, and 1/3 of the attackers were going to be left over. They were going to remain and eventually be incorporated into God's nation, which will include the entire earth. Now we're finding out that the people among the Jews, the defenders, the people living in the city, also are going to have half of them exiled from the city, and half of them will remain. So half of them will be scattered around the world again and suffer this terrible suffering during this terrible battle. And God will go. So this war is going to happen. It's going to look like the people of Jerusalem are losing the war. However, God himself will go out and wage war against these nations. Just like God wages war on a day of combat. It sounds like this kind of war is a different kind of combat. But just like God stands behind people when there's actual combat between one army and another going on, here God is going to go out and wage war, but in a different style, his own style, which Yamdu Raglav Bayom Mahu, and his feet will stand on that day Al Har Azesim, on the Mount of Olives, which is the mountain that is to the east of Jerusalem. God will stand upon Har Azesim, Asher al Pnei Yerushalayim, the mountain which faces Jerusalem, and Mikedem from the east. V'nivka Har Azesim Eichetzio Mizracha V'yama. There will be a massive shaking of the earth which will split the Mount of Olives into two. Meichetzro Mizracha V'yama, east to west split. It will just split in part. Gei Gedola Miyod, and it will create this tremendous chasm, this tremendous valley between the two. Umash Chatzio Har Tzafona V'Chatzio Negba, and half of the mountain will move towards the north, and half of the mountain will move towards the south. So this massive valley will be created in this giant earthquake, v'nastem. Now, the word v'nastem here is variously translated as what would usually be pronounced v'nistam, and it will be stopped up or closed up, which is how the Targum Yonasan translates it. However, I'm going to go with the Radak's translation, who translates it the much more simple way, that, and you will run, people will run out of fear. They're frightened, the world is shaking, the ground is cracking open, there's this massive earthquake. Gei horai, you're going to run into, past the valley that's between my mountains. Ki agia gei harim, because you are going to, because this gei harim, this valley that opened up between the mountains, will go so far it will reach El Otzal, to a place called Otzal, which is presumably far away. V'nastem, and you're going to want to run to a place where this valley isn't, to a place where the earth hasn't cracked open. And you will run kasher nastem epnei arash, just like everyone ran when there was an earthquake b'imei Uzziah Melech Yehuda, during the days of Uzziah, the king of Yehuda, many years prior. The memory of that massive earthquake at the time of Uzziah, which is also mentioned by the prophet Amos and hinted to by the prophet Isaiah. This was a major event in the history of the people that were carried on in the collective memory of the people. Just like everyone ran then to try to find a safe place and not to get hurt from the earthquake, the same thing you will run when this massive earthquake occurs, because God is going to wage war by shaking the earth. And then on this day, when you're running, everyone is frightened, everyone is scared. This is the day that God is going to come. Kol Kedoshim Imach. Literally, that means all of the holy ones with you. Now, what does that mean, all of the holy ones are with you? So some translate holy ones as referring to angels. That's the typical translation of most of the classic Mefarshim, most of the classic commentaries, that God will come and all of the angels and all of God's cohorts will come with him. The Radak, who I'm going to translate and go with the Radak's translation here, using the Radak most of this chapter, if you haven't noticed, is brings the language of the Rambam of Maimonides in Mor Nevuchim in his Guide to the Perplexed, who talks about the Kedoshim, and the Kedoshim here are not referring to any spiritual beings, but he's referring to the prophets, all of those prophets that have been talking until now. And the Rambam is really saying this, Maimonides is saying this, because if you recall, this entire book of Zechariah, he was constantly reminding us that he was following in the footsteps of the earlier prophets that had said these things. Zechariah is reiterating the prophecies that the people were already familiar with. So, Kol Kedoshim Imach, all of those holy ones that have taught you over the years that one day the day of God will come, they are all with you. And that is the day that God will come, and that is the day that I, Zechariah, now am talking about. V'hoya bayom ha'u, in verse 6. And on that day it will be something different, something unusual. Again, I'm translating like the Radak does. Lo hiya or yikarot. The precious, bright light of the sun, v'kipa'on, and the light that comes from the moon and the stars, which is really what happens in darkness. So neither the light nor the darkness will be around on that day, because there will be both suffering and redemption. There will be such a mix of the two that the day won't be able to be called a great, wonderful day, nor will it be able to be called a terrible day, because there will be both redemption and suffering occurring. V'hoya, again on the same theme, verse 7, Yom Echad Hu, it will be one day, all mixed, Yivadal Adonai. This day is only known to God when this day is going to happen. Hopefully Zechariah is thinking, hopefully you people that he's talking to will bring it about and bring the redemption soon, but if not soon, it will be later. Only God knows when it will happen. It will be a day of lo yom v'lo laila. It's not going to be a day of day, meaning a day of great redemption and joy, nor will it be a day of sadness and terror, because it will be a mix. However, when the day is over, when the sun is setting on that day, so to speak, then finally there will be light, and we will see light, and the suffering will end. This is verse 8. And on that day, life-giving waters will come from Jerusalem. This image Zechariah mentioned in the last chapter when he talked about in in chapter 13, when he mentioned the makor niftach, a wellspring, a fountain will open in order to purify the people. And Zechariah was referring back to the vision of Ezekiel, who talks about how that when the future temple and the redemption happens, there will be this river, this life-giving river that flows forth from the temple all around the world. Zechariah is clearly referring to that event. That day, that water will come out of Jerusalem. Part of the water will flow eastward towards the sea, towards the east, which is presumably referring to the Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, and some of it will flow to the western sea. Remember, I've mentioned several times, I mentioned earlier that when we talk about Acharon or Acharei, it's referring to the west. So that would be the Mediterranean Sea, presumably. This will not be a temporary wadi that flows only during the rainy season, but whether it's the rainy season or the summer dry season, this will constantly flow. This life-giving water, the Mayim Chaim, coming from Jerusalem, will be always. V'haya, and on that day it will be, so verse 9, Adonai, God will be lemelech al kol haaretz, God will be king over the entire world. Bayomahu, on that day, that future day, that day, Adonai acharush moacha, that day God will be one, His name will be one, because the entire world will then know God. Yisov kol haaretz ko arava, what will happen, verse 10, the entire land will become like the arava, migeva l'rimon. The arava is the wilderness, meaning it will all grow green, migeva l'rimon, negev Yerushalayim, from Geva to Rimon, south of Jerusalem, which is generally desert, v'ra'ama v'yashva tachtea, and it will be raised high, and underneath this land, Mishar Benyamin, from the gates of Benjamin, Ad Makom Shahar Rishon, until the place of the original old gate, Ad Shar HaPinim, until the gate of Pinim, Umigdal Hananel, and the tower of Hananel, Ad Yikvei HaMelech, till the king's wine presses. He's giving out places, not 100% clear what all of these places are, but the point being that the bounty coming from Jerusalem will spread throughout the land. V'yashvuva, and the people will then finally live within the land. V'cherem lo ye'od, there will no longer be destruction of the land. V'yashva Yerushalayim levetach, and the city Jerusalem will remain and dwell and live securely forever for the rest of time. V'zos, however, the others, those that were waging war, the ones that didn't do so well, v'zos ha'magefa, and what's going to happen is, this is the plague that will come upon Asher Yigof Adonai es kol ha'amim, that God is going to set out against all of these nations, Asher tzavu al Yerushalayim, that waged war against Jerusalem. Hamek b'saro v'hu omed al raglav, their flesh will rot from their bodies even as they're standing. Be'enov timakna b'choreyan, and his eyes, those that waged war against Jerusalem, against God, their eyes will rot in their sockets. U'lushonot timak b'fiyem, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. V'haya bayomahu, and on that day, what will happen? Tiyeh muhumas Adonai rabba bohem, the tumult, the tumultuousness that's caused by God's wrath will be so great among all of these people. V'achziku ish yad re'ehu, people will start grabbing each other. V'yalsa yado al yad re'ehu, and start hitting each other and killing each other, just because of this great confusion and suffering going on among these people. V'gam Yehuda, and even Yehuda tilachem b'Yerushalayim, will wage war in Jerusalem. Now there's many ways of understanding this. This could mean also Yehuda, meaning the other cities of Jerusalem, and we've had this before, if you listen to the last chapter and the chapter before, will wage war on behalf of Jerusalem. The other cities will come on behalf of Jerusalem and wage war to protect it. That's one way of understanding it. We also had reference last chapter of Judeans, people of Judah who were impressed into the army against their will to fight against Judah. So even they are also fighting against Jerusalem, could be another way of understanding that. It could also be understood that some of the people of Judah, maybe we mentioned some that were exiled, some that lost, were actually willingly fighting against Judah. So there are Jews among those that are the attackers. So not only, so they themselves also will be among the attackers, and unfortunately will then have to suffer the fate of the attackers. So there's many ways of understanding. So this could be talking about the defenders or the attackers. It all depends exactly how you translate it. Ve'usaf chel kol hagoyim saviv, and the great wealth of all of the nations that surround Jerusalem will be gathered. Zav v'chesef u'begadim l'rov ma'od. Lots of gold and silver and clothing and all kinds of riches and wealth will be gathered there against the people of Jerusalem. V'chein tiyeh magefas asus. And just like I said I was going to strike the people, I am going to do the same to their weapons, to their horses, hapered and their mules, hagomel and their camels, v'yachamor and their donkeys, v'chol habehema and all of the animals asher yeh b'machnos ahema that are gathered in those war camps against Jerusalem, kamagifa azos, they will suffer the same fate. The animals will suffer the same fate as their masters. However, verse 16, those that remain, the remnant of those nations, the ones that are not destroyed, the ones that remain with God, the ones that that stop the fight against Jerusalem and humble themselves before God, they will remain and for years and years on later, every year they will come to bow to the King, the Lord God Himself, and to celebrate as Chag Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, also known as the festival of booths. As we know, the festival of Sukkot was particularly a festival which is always celebrated for the entire world. We bring the sacrifices that are dedicated to all of the nations of the world on Sukkot. It is therefore fitting, and it is also the holiday which the Torah emphasizes repeatedly as a holiday of happiness, the holiday of celebration. It is fitting that those remnants of those armies, the ones who decided to humble themselves before God and join the people of God, just like Zechariah mentioned, every time he talked about destruction, he always pointed out that not everyone will be destroyed. There will be those who will end up joining the people of God, and he's emphasizing that here too. But those that choose not to join, from all the different families from around the world, the ones that choose not to come to Jerusalem, to bow, in other words, to humble themselves, to the King God Himself, they will suffer the fate. They will suffer for that. They will not have rain. They will suffer drought and poverty. If, for example, the family of Egypt, Lo Ta'aleh, decides, we're not going to go to God, Velova, and they don't come, Velo Aleim Tiyeh HaMagefa, and they think to themselves that we will therefore not, we will still not suffer the same fate, Asher Yigof Adonai Sagayim, that God is making suffer all the other nations. Asher Lo Yalu L'Chogas Chag Sukkos, the ones that don't come and they're thinking that they can get away with it. Zos Tiyeh Chatas Mitzrayim, this will be considered a sin of Egypt. Chatas Kol Hagayim, this will be the sin of all of the nations. Asher Lo Yalu L'Chog Chag Sukkos, to come and celebrate the holiday of Sukkot. Bayomahu, on that day, the day that all the nations of the world come to celebrate Sukkot together, when there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions upon millions of people coming to Jerusalem to celebrate together. Yeah, Metzilos Hasus, the Metzilos, the bells that are hanging around the necks of the horses will be written Kodesh LaAdonai. These are holy to God. Those horses, which were once, so often Zechariah mentioned the horse as the symbol of war, of the symbol of the warriors coming to attack Jerusalem. Now those horses are going to be considered holy to God. Not that they're being brought as sacrifices, of course, as the horse is not a kosher animal, but this means that they will be considered consecrated and they will be considered temple property. V'haya hasiros, and all of the pots cooking, there will be so many sacrifices and so much meat being consumed by so many people coming to celebrate the Beis Adonai, that all of the pots being used will all be within the temple itself, because there will be so much to eat from the sacrifices from the holy things, that all the pots will be kamizrakim lefnei mizbeach. They will be holy, just like the bowls used to spray the blood upon the altar. So will all the pots be used for holy things. And it will be again called Sir B'Yushalayim. This is verse 21. Every pot in Jerusalem will be Yehuda, and in Yehuda and in Judah, Kodesh L'Adonai Tzvaos. They will all be holy to God, because they will all be being used for the purpose of sacrifices, for the purposes of holy meat, for the purposes of celebrating together. Uvo kol azovchem, and all of the people that are coming to bring these sacrifices will all come. V'lakhu mehem, and they will take from these pots. V'shluvahem, and they will cook their food in the pots. V'lo yiyeh kinani, and there will no longer be any merchants. There won't be any buying and selling. People won't be running around looking to buy and sell pots and so on in mundane ways, because it would be totally unnecessary, because everything will be there. So many people will be bringing so many supplies that people just come and take, and everything is there for free. No longer will they have to haggle and debate prices and so on. So there will no longer be such a Knani beveis Adonai Tzvaos, in the house of the Lord God. Bayomahu, on that day in the future, when everyone will have everything they need in Jerusalem when they come to celebrate together. This is the end of the beautiful book of Zechariah, this beautiful vision of the day in the future when the entire world comes to celebrate together, when everyone has food to eat, everyone has holy food to eat, and everyone is there to worship and bow before God Himself on the holiday of Sukkot. Thank you so much for studying the book of Zechariah together with me. We will next study the book of Malachi, who is also the final prophet, the last of the prophets, the last of the 12 minor prophets, but also the last prophet, period. After studying Malachi together, I will then continue with this theme of studying the books that pertain to this period, the early Second Temple period, and we will study the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which occurred contemporaneous to the prophets we have just been studying, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So we'll do Ezra and Nehemiah, Malachi next, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. Thank you so much for studying together with me.